with a lot of bias from all sides in the media, I think. And that's why I partnered with Ground News, because they're the best tool for me to stay objective with my reporting. Ground News is an app and a website that pulls in news coverage from around the world and puts it in one place so you can see how every angle of a story is being told. It shows us how out of over 700 different publications covering this story about NATO, it leans slightly left on the spectrum. Ground News visually identifies and tags if the source is right or left leaning, and if it's independent, private equity, or a media conglomerate. It's this kind of transparency that even managed to get my dad to start being more sympathetic to hearing the other side out. Because I believe in Ground News so much, we're offering 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use to just $5 a month. If you're news curious like I am, click the link in the description or go to ground.news/Cappy or scan the QR code to get a clearer understanding of the world. A nation that forgets its past has no future. The reason Britain is proposing such a massive change to their military is similar to what happened to many nations after the end of World War II. Decades of reduced funding with some mismanaged budgets mixed in there. At the absolute height of World War II, Britain's back was legitimately up against the wall. They were suffering a brutal bombing campaign from the Nazis, forcing them to ration food. Therefore, by the end of World War II, there were over 5 million British personnel serving across the branches, or about 25% of the entire male population.
So between World War II and 1990, we had a very strong set of military capabilities, and that's gradually been shrunk over time.
Defense spending peaked at about 50% of GDP during the war. It cost the UK around £1 trillion, which was the equivalent of about 200% of its GDP at the time. Britain had to sell off about a quarter of their overseas assets, and it became heavily reliant on US loans. Demobilization, though, started right after World War II, and by 1948, they were down to about 1 million personnel in their forces. But the threats weren't over for them. They couldn't relax that easily. The Soviet Union's border in East Berlin was only 570 miles or 920 kilometers away from London in the UK. That's like the distance from New York to North Carolina was where Soviet troops were positioned for them. This is why British troop levels during the 1950s had to remain high at about 800,000. I would argue one of the most influential people on British national defense strategy at this time was Field Marshal Montgomery, who was a famous World War II tank commander, and he argued for a strong armored force that was forward deployed in Europe. He wrote in his memoir, "I was deeply concerned that the British Army was being allowed to run down too fast. The danger was that we would end up with an army that appeared respectable but could not be relied upon in war." Montgomery was instrumental in the creation of what was called the British Army of the Rhine, which was 60,000 British troops and 800 main battle tanks forward deployed in West Germany against Soviet Union. He said, quote, "The British Army of the Rhine must be a real fighting force, not a token presence. It must have enough men and tanks to face the Soviet threat on the ground. Only then can it serve as an effective deterrent." End quote.
Something I read about and just learned about very recently was the British Army of the Rhine.
Yeah, so back then, we had a core-size force in Germany of 55,000, and that was 3 armoured divisions, an artillery division, a substantial force, all armoured, positioned within 4 hours of their deployment zones. And when you contrast what we have today, it's very different.
That's interesting. That's sort of what it feels like the British military would like to be able to do once again today.
Any wise, pound foolish. However, everything changed when in 1953, the United Kingdom gave birth to their first nuclear weapon. Allow me to introduce you to the man with the new National Defense Plan. Duncan Sandys. Sandys was a former World War II naval commander and then Minister of Defense. He led the creation of the Defense White Paper of 1957. It's the direct predecessor of today's Strategic Defense Review that we're going to get into. It was one of the most consequential documents in British military history, and you could argue one of the most radical defense policy shifts for them ever that we're still feeling to this day. The paper outlined how Britain believed a battle with the Soviet Union would be carried out out by nuclear weapons, it would ultimately be on the American Air Force to win. So they planned to reduce the size of the British Army and Air Force drastically and focus on their navy. The white paper called for ending conscription by 1963. It set a precedent that Britain would rely on nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet aggression, which would allow them to minimize their expansive, large standing conventional forces. It was a have my cake and eat it too kind of moment, where they could still defend against the Soviet Union while not maintaining a large, expensive standing army.
I mean, you're absolutely right. People justified nuclear weapons saying if we had a nuclear capability, we would not need such large and significant land forces. And I think to a certain extent, that's true. But if you really lose any significant conventional capabilities, then nuclear weapons become your only recourse. So really, we do need land forces for some kind of scaled escalation.
This marked the point at which Britain acknowledged that it could no longer afford to maintain a global military presence on the scale required to defend its vast colonial empire. Troop levels started to sharply decline to about 350,000, and defense spending fell to 5% by the 1970s. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, the British government, like most NATO members, saw this as the long-awaited peace dividend. With no existential threat on the horizon, they started slashing defense budgets left and right. They reduced force structure and closed overseas bases. The British Army of the Rhine was formally disbanded in 1994. By the mid-1990s, British regular forces were down to around 220,000 personnel, and the trend of downsizing would continue year after year. London had once again become one of the world's premier financial hubs. At the same time, the UK was still involved in a number of high-tempo operations, from peacekeeping in Bosnia to air operations over Kosovo. They were doing more with less, and at first, they made it work. British forces maintained their highly professional and well-respected reputation on the world stage, and the UK joined the United States in the global war on terror, committing tens of thousands of troops to Afghanistan and Iraq.
After 9/11, the army was reconfigured around MRAPs for counterinsurgency operations, not heavy armor for fighting a peer adversary. And we've really suffered there. So Challenger numbers have really sunk to a very low level.
By 2010, regular British Army strength had dropped to 100,000, and total defense spending was sitting at about 2.5% of GDP, on a downward trend. Even while defense budgets were slashed, they were still responsible for some of the world's most innovative inventions in the defense world,
including Chobham armor and law anti-tank missiles and long-range storm shadows.
Then came the 2010 Strategic Defense and Security Review, which was conducted in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. The review marked another major inflection point. The UK government announced deep cuts across all three services, driven by financial constraints. Most notably, we saw the regular British Army cut to 82,000 troops, and the Harrier fleet and aircraft carrier was retired. The UK still had a world-class nuclear submarine force and special forces, but the depth, mass, and sustainability of the force had been hollowed out. By the late 2010s, respected defense analysts and even British generals began to publicly warn that the UK was no longer capable of fighting a sustained war against.
I'm pretty much gonna keep on going until my eyes close or until I run out of liquor.
A peer adversary. But who the heck cared at the time? There seemed to be no credible, massive threat against them.
It was a decade where there was really no grand strategy. Figured out what we wanted the British Army to do or how it should be organised. And this was because there was no real threat at that time.
Years of underfunding, a focus on counterinsurgency over conventional warfare, and political indecision had taken its toll. If the enemy doesn't kill you, bureaucracy will. However, by 2021, the government published another white paper called the Integrated Review, which saw the Army shrink to where it stands today at just about 73,000 regular soldiers, its smallest size in over 300 years. when the population was 4 times smaller. Defense spending was now at its lowest point of 2.2% GDP. The British Army, once capable of deploying over 400,000 soldiers in continental Europe, was now reduced to a single deployable division, reliant on US logistical support.
And we have just 14 artillery systems, 14 155mm guns. That's astonishing. And I personally believe that's way too low. So I'd like to see us have 4 regular tank regiments and 2 reserves, and that's probably around 300 tanks.
You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Then the world was shocked. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was taken as a wake-up call by the United Kingdom. And the problems started pouring in now, as a report by the National Audit Office found that the British military ammo stockpiles were so low, they were forced to reduce donations to Ukraine. They concluded that further donations of lethal aid would pose unacceptable risks to the UK military's readiness, and would take 10 years to replace. Ben Wallace, the UK's former Defence Secretary of 2023, said the armed forces had become hollowed out and underfunded. In February 2024, the UK House of Commons Defence Committee published a report aptly titled "Ready for War?" In it, they assessed there were multiple shortfalls for large-scale combat operations, including not enough personnel and shortage of stockpile of munitions. The UK contributes a presence of forward-deployed 1,000 land forces and 2 squadrons of main battle tanks in Poland and Estonia, as well as air support for the region as part of Operation Gavrid. These are a tripwire force designed to hold up just long enough for American reinforcements to arrive. But the United States government has signaled that they may no longer shoulder the defense burden in Europe in the same way that they had for the past few decades. Which brings us to 2025 and this brand spanking new Strategic Defense Review. And it outlines 62 acceptable recommendations that will prepare Britain for war. After reading through the document, the big giant bottom line up front is, I think, summed up in one word: the Navy. Britain is investing heavily in a hybrid drone navy, based on the success of Ukraine's maritime attack drones that they have. The reason for this investment is because the Royal Navy today only has 14 destroyers and frigates, many of which have maintenance and operational problems, and that number will now increase to 25. The HMS Prince of Wales aircraft carrier also had maintenance issues that will now get new renovations and investment. These naval forces will be a what's called Europe First or NATO First investment that the UK plans to mainly distribute to its NATO allies. The UK currently has 10 submarines that'll increase to 22, which is where their ability to launch nuclear weapons lies. These will be continuously built, with one being pumped out every 18 months. The reason why the UK is focusing on their navy at the expense of other branches is partly because of something called the GEOC Gap, which is the strategic naval bottleneck choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. The gap being the 2 stretches of open ocean among these 3 land masses. It's one of Earth's most sexy natural forming thigh gaps. This is the front line for the Royal Navy to monitor and intercept Russian submarines as they try to come in from the Kola Peninsula into the Atlantic Ocean. This region is vital for NATO logistics and forces coming from America. This natural geographic water obstacle that has existed throughout history is a huge part of the reason why the UK has always focused resources on their navy.
I was expecting there to be more investment into the army and into tanks. And I don't know, I'm trying to understand kind of what the thinking is.
Yeah, so the strategy that seems to be emerging is that, look, we're based in the UK, we can't deploy to Europe quickly, but let's leave the land stuff to Poland and Germany, and let's focus on the stuff we can do, which is the naval stuff and the air stuff. And I think that is a sensible strategy.
In 1713, Britain took control of the Strait of Gibraltar when they tactically acquired it from war with Spain. The Strait of Gibraltar is one of the most important strategic maritime choke points on Earth. 30% of the global seaborne oil transits this narrow 8-mile wide choke point that links Europe, Africa, and Asia. So this outpost here is crucial to denying adversaries access from the Mediterranean and to keep Allied logistics flowing freely, and the UK is responsible for it. The UK's Air Force is at about 107 fighter jets, a mix of F-35s and Typhoons that are being retired. The new plan will increase to 74 more F-35s, an additional drone wingmen, and a 6th generation aircraft known as the Tempest on the horizon. And this gets us to the most controversial part, the British Army. The Army is getting the least amount of focus based on the strategic priorities, but it's not without any love. The UK plans to spend £6 billion to build 6 new munition factories that'll procure 7,000 long-range missiles and a constant supply of shells. This is part of what they're calling their defense dividend, which is a turn of phrase on the peace dividend. They say the defense spending will create thousands of new jobs and help boost the economy. The plan is to increase personnel by 30,000 to 100,000 soldiers in the army. The document outlines a key concept of their ground forces. The infantry needs to be 10 times more lethal, they say, and that's the key phrase. If someone asked me to be 10 times more better at my job, I'd probably say, but how? Am I getting 10 times more resources? But no, you're getting drone swarms and AI software to make up for it. This is how they get to have their cake and eat it too. The answer isn't just nukes this time, it's drones. The Defense Review states that infantry units will go by what's called a 20-40-40 mix, which is kind of a fascinating theory. The US military appears to be going in a similar direction, in fact, and militaries around the world are going this way. It breaks down as follows: 20% crewed platforms like your tanks, IFVs, your human operators, 40% high-end, reusable, uncrewed platforms like autonomous drones that can survive multiple missions, and 40% expendable consumables, which is like loitering munitions, kamikaze, single-use drones. The end result is the UK force plans to be 80% unmanned. This is a heavy reliance on drones.
Is this new Martyr tank initiative, and that is main armoured tank of Europe to rebuild main battle tank capacity, and that will see maybe as many as 4,000 new tanks acquired, and that will give us a mass of main battle tanks, enabling us to really take the fight to Russia.
But here is what I think explains all of this the best. Nuclear weapons are extremely expensive to maintain. Their strategy has evolved to a strategic logic that I would like to call do what others can't, which is keeping that nuclear button working, and that button is a lot more expensive than you might think. The new Dreadnought-class ballistic missile submarine will be an investment around $30 billion plus a $10 billion contingency, and it starts to become clear why the UK can't afford a giant standing army.
Yeah, I would summarise it really. It's a triumph of ambition over substance. You know, it's all, hey, these are all the things we want to do, not these are all the things we're going to do. I always think, compare the challenge of rebuilding UK defence. It's like the roof of a house. You know, every year you lose tiles from the roof and you have to replace them. And if you have a program of always replacing roof tiles, then the roof will last indefinitely. But if you leave it and do nothing for 30 years, you eventually reach a point where you have to replace the whole roof, and that's always much more expensive than the incremental taking care of it. And that's where we are in the UK.
While Britain's new defense strategy may be wrapped in drones, nukes, and frigates in the Navy, at its core, it's a blunt admission, I think. The age of peace dividends is over, and the UK is gearing up for real war, one that could reach from the trenches to our tap water.
If you want to get more content, I just launched my new show, Simple Sabotage, with my buddy Patrick on our new channel. Link is in the description. We cover hour-long deep dives into exciting military stories there. If you're looking to support the work that we do at this channel, you can grab our new Tank Evolution t-shirt. It's available on our merch store. Just go to www.cappyarmy.com where you can get sources, show notes, and exclusive content. The US Army is quietly building this massive new fleet of 3,000 tracked armored vehicles. But weirdly, this billion-dollar program has flown completely under the radar with no one talking about it, and many don't even know it exists, even though it'll make up 30% of the future heavy armored brigades in the US Army.
What are you doing?
Nothing.
and they've gone just full sicko mode with its firepower. I'm talking about versions with rapid fire mortars, Javelin anti-tank missiles, 30mm autocannons, or Stinger anti-air missiles that can clap the cheeks of enemy drones. And it does all this while carrying a bunch of infantry in the hull, fueled by ripets and hate. In this episode, I want to explore with you why the new armored multi-purpose vehicle is getting so little attention, and how it will revolutionize the way that the US Army uses its support vehicles in combat. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out. But before we get into that, the only way this video is possible is thanks to Odoo. Odoo prides itself on the motto, "Unity makes creative strength," and through its robust, seemingly never-ending suite of business management applications, its ability to unite with my creative workflow, for one, has proven to strengthen pretty much every aspect of my day-to-day operations. And today, I want to focus mainly on my favorite part of the platform, and what I think really differentiates it from a lot of other competitors out there, its user interface. No matter whether you're using just one application or you have many applications across multiple businesses in different cities, selecting your database to reflect exactly what you want to see is as easy as a touch of the button, and it's completely customizable. That means you can collate and function the right data at the right time, which I've found to drastically decrease the amount of time that I spend on things like balancing budgets, authorizing payroll, and checking sales trends. So if you're looking for a simple and easy to use software platform for business management, be sure to check out odoo.com. The first application is free for life. You don't even need a credit card. Initially, the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle, or AMPV as it's called, started its life in 2014 as a humble replacement for the ancient fleet of Vietnam-era M113s. If you ask me, it's kind of crazy to think that it took that long for them to start replacing vehicles from the 1960s. Originally, the defense company BAE Systems won the proposal to replace the 113 by suggesting hey, what if we just gutted the M2 Bradley chassis so that it was turretless and we used that? Stop trying to use logic, Carl. This is the defense industry. We don't do that here. By the way, you're fired. Using a version of the Bradley hull would save oodles of money each year, like $2 billion, and it would make spare parts commonality among the majority of tracked armored vehicles. But we'll see, it ended up being much more than that. Because after producing a couple hundred vehicles, in October 2024, the world was shocked to see the full potential of the AMPV. They revealed video footage of it with a turret and a freaking 30mm autocannon on top. I admit, I am a simple man. I see a death machine that spits high explosive rounds, and it has my undivided attention. Unlike the Bradley, this turret is unmanned, which means there's a lot more space in the hull for extra supplies or infantry. So much room for activities. I mean that sincerely. Look at this diagram that looks like an AMPV swallowed an M113 whole. The gray area shows the size of the old M113 versus the new AMPV. It's 78% bigger. This thing has a lot more space. You might think that because it's the larger caliber than the Bradley 25 Mike, that's the reason why it's better, but mainly the bigger 30mm round really just allows for the new use of high-tech ammo like airburst rounds. The whole system is called the Kongsberg medium caliber turret, made by the Norwegian company, which explains why it's so sexy. The old M2 Bradley turret took up a lot of space and sat 2 people inside of it, making it really cramped like a case of sardines. Here's a good diagram that shows the difference, I think. See how the manned turret in the Bradley takes up about half the space of the hull? No bueno! This new one removes the need for any of that. Net warriors in the comment section on the AMPV were quick to point this out, saying, quote, "Wouldn't that just make it back into a Bradley again?" Laugh out loud. They said, "Mom, I want XM30. We have XM30 at home." Well, that's just a Bradley with 5 more millimeters. Literally, are we just reinventing the Bradley here with more utility? And one other net warrior said, "Turreted turretless Bradley." Fellow internet gentlemen, you make great points. I guess it is kind of an off-brand, next-generation infantry fighting vehicle. But there are some major changes here, I think, that make it more of an alternative brand than an off-brand. The AMPV continued to get even more based when they added a remote-controlled cannon with no turret whatsoever.
This weapons package even showed that you could put a Javelin anti-tank missile on there instead of the tow missile. The ugly duckling just got beautiful. Sure, there's downsides to no turret system, it's not stabilized, but this was still impressive, I think. And there are even versions that fire 4 Javelin anti-tank missiles so fast that it'll make your tank's turret pop. This was the moment when the significance of this program really dawned on me. Think about it this way. Legit 33% of the US Army's Armored Brigade combat team could now get a huge upgrade in firepower and anti-drone capabilities. The current plan isn't to create any of these 30mm cannon versions, but now that it's an option, it's something to keep an eye on for the future. Personally, I think the Army should invest more into these autocannon versions. I think the reason why this has gotten so little attention is because of the vehicle it's replacing. The old M113 was lacking in firepower and armor. For most of its history, it was relegated to roles in the rear. It was never given the sexy jobs of blowing the face off the enemy, which means people with my kind of tism didn't want to hear about that as much. But we'll see, that's all about to change. The US Army is now totally reimagining this whole concept of what a support vehicle could be in the future. A sign of the importance of the AMPV program is that in 2024, BAE Systems landed an additional $750 million contract, which added to their initial deal, and that means that America is now investing $1.6 billion into the armored multipurpose vehicle, which makes it one of the most significant capabilities currently in full rate production, and why I think it's worth talking about. I think this is the Army's best kept secret that's been hiding right in plain sight. Remember, those original hulls were mostly manufactured decades ago in the 1980s. Since then, technology's come a long way. Case in point, the new AMPV hull is manufactured from one single piece instead of being assembled from multiple pieces. It's one single monolithic hull. It's a combination of steel and spaced armor instead of old flimsy M113 aluminum ones. According to the company Alcoa that does this whole process of basically 3D printing hulls, they said, quote, "Based on early modeling and simulation, single-pieced underbody structures could provide 2 times better protection against blasts than traditional hulls, primarily by eliminating welded seams. In addition to survivability benefits, single-piece hulls can be optimized to reduce vehicle weight and assembly time, and therefore overall cost." End quote. So when you look closer, what's really going on here is that it's more than just an M2 Bradley 3.0. This is why, for the time being, I am firmly in the AMPV enjoyer category. As they would say in the CIA, what's the bluff? The bottom line up front is that what all of this means is that the US Army, if they wanted to, could easily adapt thousands of AMPV vehicles into next-generation improved infantry fighting vehicles. Plus, compared to the M113, it would have a 600 horsepower engine with power generation abilities that can run all the sweet new systems and capabilities that we're about to get into. What we're seeing is people talking about how this AMPV could potentially be used as a kind of backdoor channel to build the next generation infantry fighting vehicle without saying they're building a next generation infantry fighting vehicle. Another net warrior wrote on a popular forum, quote, "Until there is a real revolution in vehicle design, AMPV/Bradley upgrades still make more sense than an OMFV." The OMFV is, of course, the next generation Bradley to replace the Bradley. So another keyboard warrior wrote, quote, "So they take an M2 Bradley, an IFV, remove the turret, creating an AMPV, APC, then added again a turret because it looks cool. A gender fluid vehicle." So I have it on good rumor intelligence that the AMPV could potentially become an IFV for the US Army. If we wanted further proof of that, and how they're trying to push this as a legit fighting vehicle, look at how BAE Systems entered it into the competition to become Romania's new IFV to replace their Soviet-era BMPs. See? Other completely mentally stable people see the connection too. It's not just me. How do we know that these vehicles are needed so badly on today's battlefield? To dig deeper, I read through this congressional research report, so you don't have to. It revealed that the US government has sent 300 M113s, 300 armored medical treatment vehicles to Ukraine. That's a total of roughly 600 of the M113s that were pulled from US Army National Guard units to send to Ukraine. That's twice the amount compared to the amount of M2 Bradleys that were sent. According to the CRS report, America's Army is replacing each of those 600 old vehicles with a brand new AMPV, and reportedly the whole reason the Pentagon was able to fast-track that program was thanks to transferring those old obsolete vehicles to Ukraine. The old M113 carriers in Ukraine were put to heavy use, we saw, providing their value in medical evacuations and transporting supplies and infantry to the front. But their limitations of armor and firepower were again on full display. It's not a perfect vehicle. On the famous website Oryx, which tracks all the losses of equipment, vehicles for both Russia and Ukraine, they reported 234 of the M113s had been destroyed or abandoned. That's roughly 39% of the total, and it makes it clear to me why these are called obsolete. If you're interested in learning more about the armored battle in Ukraine, I release weekly combat footage analysis episodes on Pepperbox TV. The link is in the description. Here's Bill Sheehy, BAE Systems program director for this project, and he said, quote, "Our goal with the AMPV common top plate has remained the same since day one. We are demonstrating the time and cost-effective options the AMPV brings to the table for soldiers who need new and evolving capabilities quickly so they're ready for today's battlefields and can easily adapt the unpredictable needs that will be occurring decades from now." End quote. I read that in a British accent because BAE Systems is a British company, but I just looked, and according to Bill's LinkedIn page, he was in the US Army for at least 9 years, so I need to issue a retraction and an apology for cultural appropriation. I'm sorry about that, Bill. But what I believe we're observing here is that the armorer designers who learned something valuable since the end of the Cold War. Big Army thinks that they know what they want 10 years from now, but rarely they actually do. So instead of trying to predict what they'll need in 10 years, BAE built the AMPV to be able to adapt to any request. It's like ordering the tour of Italy at Olive Garden or the breakfast sampler at IHOP. When you don't know what you want, it's nice to have all the options on the table, because the biggest revolution here is that the AMPV isn't just a one-trick pony, it's actually at least a 5-trick pony. You've got your general purpose version, your mortar carrier, medical evacuation treatment, mission command center, but there's also a huge list of unofficial versions, like when you order off the secret menu at In-N-Out. I'm hungry. There is a SHORAD anti-air version with 8 Stinger missiles, radar detection, and a 30 mic on top. And it's already been successfully live fired and tested against drones. Here's the video footage of the AMPV shooting down tiny drones at distance. It uses something called a slew to cue capability here. What it does is it automatically slews the cannon barrel to aim where the drone is queued up to, so the radar automatically aims the gun barrel and engages with proximity airburst rounds to explode near the drone. I love everything about this. I like the idea of a low-cost, flexible solution that's built on top of a proven platform. But don't worry, there's still plenty of time for the Army to prove me dead wrong. I've gone as far as I can into this video without using one of the defense industry's favorite buzzwords, but I can go no further. It must be said, the AMPV is modular. It's not just a shitty word used here to make it sound better, it can actually change in meaningful ways. Case in point, when I say the AMPV is a mortar carrier, I'm not talking about like the old lame Striker mortar or the 113 mortar carrier, which basically just opened up the back and surprise, there's a 120mm mortar team hidden back there. That's more like a Striker clown car convertible that comes down and awkwardly reveals a couple of 11 Charlie mortarmen waving hello in the back. Hinges for a hatch isn't exactly new tech, and even a fully reread guy like myself could figure that out. No, this is a new system. This is a self-propelled automatic mortar cannon on a turret called the Patria Neo.